The private archives of the Blackwood estate, unsealed only a century after her death, do not speak of a duchess who was rescued, but of a viscountess who was unleashed. They tell a story not of a fragile flower saved from the frost, but of a resilient root that broke the stone that sought to crush it. Her name was Eleanora, and her story began in the quiet, gilded cage of a loveless marriage, where her husband, Viscount Alistair Thorne, treated her soul as if it were nothing more than a line item in his ledger. Eleanora had been a sensible match. That was the word society used, a dull grey word for a transaction that had secured Alistair her modest but unencumbered dowry. In return she had received his name, his crumbling country estate, and the profound echoing silence of his indifference. He moved through their life together as if she were a piece of furniture he had grown tired of noticing, a chair to be draped with a coat, a table upon which to leave his empty glasses. Her presence was an accepted fact, but her existence was an utter irrelevance. He saw her as plain a woman whose quiet intelligence and gentle nature were invisible currencies in the glittering, cutthroat market of the London season. Her days were measured, not in hours, but in the slow, creeping progress of the ivy across the panes of the neglected conservatory at the back of Thorne Manor. This glass house was her only sanctuary, a forgotten relic of a more hopeful era. Within its damp, earthy walls, she cultivated what she could, tending to stubborn ferns and coaxing pale, winter-starved roses into bloom. It was a kingdom of quiet, green resilience, a reflection of the life that persisted within her despite the perpetual winter of her marriage. Alistair despised the place. He saw it as a monument to decay, another asset, bleeding money he did not have, a symbol of the stagnant life he blamed her for. Alistair, for his part, was a man consumed by a ravenous hunger for what he did not possess. He craved the rank, the wealth, the effortless power that dripped from men like jewels. He saw his viscountcy as a stepping stone, and Eleanora, he had come to realise, was an anchor holding him to it. His gaze, and indeed his every waking effort, was now fixed upon Lady Beatrice Croft, an heiress whose fortune was as vast and formidable as her arrogance. She was everything Eleanora was not, dazzling, loud, and dripping with the kind of wealth that could shore up Alistair's crumbling finances and propel him into the inner circles of power. He courted her openly, his pursuit a public humiliation that Eleanora was forced to endure with a placid, dignified smile. The impending event, the social pinnacle of the season, was the Duchess of Pemberton's annual ball. It was a night when fortunes were made, alliances forged, and reputations shattered with a single whispered word. Alistair had spoken of it for weeks, his excitement a fever he did not bother to conceal. He spoke of the guests who would be there, the political connections he would make, and in tones of reverence the certainty of Lady Beatrice's attendance. He never once asked Eleanora what she would wear. He simply assumed she would perform her duty to appear to be unremarkable and to not, under any circumstances, draw focus from his grand ambitions. The night of the ball arrived on a wave of damp, chilling air. Eleanora stood before her mirror, her loyal maid, Martha, fastening the last pearl button on her gown. It was a simple dress of deep pewter silk, a colour that mirrored the stormy sky of her inner world. It was elegant, understated, and utterly her own. It was not a gown meant to attract attention, but one designed to serve as armour, a silken fortress against the indignities she knew the evening would hold. When she descended the stairs, Alistair barely glanced at her. He was preening in his own finery, a peacock whose feathers were borrowed and whose pride was built on a foundation of debt. Clear's throat. "Do try not to look so morose, Eleanora," he had snapped, his voice sharp with impatience. "You are a viscountess, not a governess attending a funeral." The Pemberton ballroom was a galaxy of light and sound. 1,000 candles burned in chandeliers that wept crystals of fire, their light glinting off jewels and shimmering silks. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, perfume, and champagne. It was a beautiful, suffocating performance, and Eleonora felt like a ghost haunting its edges. Alistair abandoned her the moment they entered, drawn like a moth to the brilliant, merciless flame of Lady Beatrice. Eleonora watched them from a distance, a silent observer of her own slow execution. She saw the way he bowed over Beatrice's hand, the way his laugh was a shade too loud, the way his eyes devoured her fortune with a desperate, pathetic greed. Needing air, she slipped through a set of French doors onto a stone terrace that overlooked the sprawling gardens. The night was cool, and the manicured hedges were shrouded in a fine mist. The distant music of the orchestra was a muted heartbeat. She leaned against the cold balustrade, closing her eyes for a single moment of peace. It was then that she heard their voices, drifting from a secluded alcove just below. It was Alistair and Beatrice, their words carrying with startling clarity on the still night air. "But what of your wife?" Beatrice's voice was laced with a cruel, mocking amusement. "The little grey mouse. What will you do with her?" Alistair's laugh was a harsh, ugly thing, Eleonora. "She is a temporary inconvenience. A placeholder, plain, quiet, and blessedly barren. Once your father and I have reached our arrangement, I shall find a way to set her aside. A quiet country estate, a small annuity. She will disappear. She is good at that. She was a sensible purchase, but her value has depreciated." He paused, and Eleonora could almost feel the sneer in his voice. "She is nothing, Beatrice. A stepping stone I have already crossed." Beatrice laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Nothing." The word did not strike her like a blow. It landed with the silent, chilling finality of a snowflake melting on stone. It was not a revelation, but a confirmation of a truth she had lived with for years. In that moment, the pain that had been her constant companion did not sharpen, it crystallized. It turned from a dull, aching sorrow into something hard, clear, and cold. The winter Alistair had forced upon her had finally frozen her heart solid, and in that state it could no longer be broken. She did not gasp. She did not weep. The carefully constructed dam of her composure held firm. She simply straightened her spine, every vertebra locking into place like a soldier on parade. Her chin lifted. With a regal composure that felt both alien and innate, she turned away from the voices and the garden and walked back towards the light of the ballroom. She did not run, she did not flee. She moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a queen abandoning a conquered territory. Her dignity was the only thing he had never been able to touch, and she wore it now like a crown of iron. From a darkened balcony above the terrace, a figure watched her retreat. He had been there the entire time, a phantom cloaked in the shadows, nursing a glass of brandy. Duke Valerius of Blackwood, a man spoken of only in whispers. The Iron Duke, they called him, a man of immense wealth and power who had retreated from society years ago after a private tragedy had encased him in a shell of impenetrable grief. He was a creature of myth, more than a man, severe, reclusive, and utterly formidable. He had seen everything. He had heard Alistair's cruel dismissal, and more importantly, he had witnessed Eleonora's response. He had seen not weakness, but a strength so profound it was almost terrifying. It was the strength of tempered steel, and it captivated him. As Eleonora reached the relative anonymity of a deserted corridor, the suffocating heat of the ballroom and the glacial chill of Alistair's words finally conspired against her. The edges of her vision blurred, the candlelight splintering into 1,000 tiny daggers. She swayed, reaching a hand out to brace herself against a marble column. She felt a presence before she saw it. A large, dark shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows. "You are unwell, Viscountess." The voice was low and resonant, like the tolling of a distant bell. It held no pity, only a quiet, declarative authority. Duke Valerius of Blackwood stood before her. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence filling the corridor. Without another word, he shrugged off his own formal coat, a magnificent thing of black velvet, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The fabric was heavy, warm, and smelled faintly of winter air and expensive tobacco. It was an anchor in the dizzying sea of her reality. "Allow me to see you to your carriage," he commanded softly. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. He offered his arm, and in a daze, Eleonora took it, allowing this formidable stranger to lead her away from the wreckage of her life. The days that followed were a blur of calculated cruelty. Alistair, having been informed by a gleeful gossip of the Duke's shocking public attention to his wife, was incandescent with a rage born of fear and wounded pride. He saw the Duke's intervention not as an act of kindness, but as a judgment upon him. He turned his fury on Eleonora, his words becoming sharper, his neglect more profound. The final, brutal blow came a week after the ball. He found her in the conservatory, her hands covered in soil as she repotted a struggling orchid. "I wouldn't waste your time with that," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pleasure. "I've sold the estate, all of it. The new owner takes possession at the end of the month. He plans to tear this dilapidated ruin down to expand the stables." He smiled. "A thin, cruel slash of a thing. I trust you will find a way to occupy your time elsewhere." That was it. The last thread tethering her to this life snapped. He was not just taking her home, he was taking her sanctuary, the one place her soul had found room to breathe. That evening, as Alistair left for a card game with his cronies, Eleonora made her decision. With Martha's silent, efficient help, she packed a single, small trunk. She took her mother's pearls, a few treasured books, and the hardy little orchid from the conservatory. She left behind the jewels Alistair had given her, the fine gowns, the empty title. She wrote a short, simple note and left it on her pillow. "I have gone." They fled in a hired carriage under the cover of a gathering storm, heading for the modest cottage of a distant cousin in the north, a place where Eleonora hoped she could simply disappear. But the Duke of Blackwood was not a man who allowed things he valued to simply disappear. The rain began to fall in earnest, turning the road into a treacherous river of mud. Their carriage wheels became stuck, the horses straining uselessly. It was in this moment of hopeless despair, stranded in the lashing rain, that a second, far grander carriage appeared, its lamps cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a predator. The carriage door opened, and the Duke himself stepped out into the storm, seemingly impervious to the wind and rain. He approached their carriage, his expression unreadable. He did not speak to the driver. He spoke directly to Eleonora through the rain-streaked window. "Your cousin's cottage will not be safe for you, Lady Thorne. Your husband will find you. He will drag you back." He paused, his gaze intense. "I have a property in the northern fells, Blackwood Manor. It is remote. It is fortified. It is yours. For as long as you have need of it, you will be safe there." It was an extraordinary offer, a lifeline thrown into the tempest. Looking into his steady, serious eyes, Eleonora saw not a predator, but a fortress. She made her choice. She and Martha were transferred to the Duke's luxurious, warm carriage, and as they pulled away, leaving her old life sinking in the mud behind them, she felt the first, terrifying flicker of hope she had known in years. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a kingdom carved from granite and shadow, rising from the stark, beautiful wilderness of the fells. It was a place of imposing towers and stone walls, but inside it was a sanctuary of surprising warmth. Fires roared in every hearth, the air smelled of beeswax and old leather, and the formidable housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Croft, oversaw everything with an iron will, but Eleonora soon discovered a surprisingly kind heart. The Duke installed Eleanora in a suite of rooms overlooking a vast walled garden, and then with a quiet nod, he largely left her to her own devices. His care was not expressed in words, but in actions. He seemed to understand that she needed space to heal, to breathe, yet his presence was a constant, comforting weight. He was a quiet observer. He noticed her interest in the manor's enormous, neglected greenhouses, and one morning a collection of rare, leather-bound books on botany appeared on the table in her sitting room. When he saw her shivering one afternoon in the garden, a heavy woolen shawl was waiting for her by the fire when she returned. He would join her sometimes for silent breakfasts in the morning room, the only sound the rustle of his newspaper and the clink of her teaspoon against china. They were quiet, shared moments that slowly began to rebuild the foundations of her shattered trust. One evening, a week into her stay, a storm raged outside, rattling the windows of the great library. Eleanora was curled in a large armchair by the fire, reading one of the botany books he had given her. The Duke was there across the room, ostensibly working on estate papers at his massive oak desk. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep. Finally, he put down his pen, his gaze finding hers across the firelit space. "My first wife, Isabel," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, was a creature of immense delicacy. Society adored her for it. They saw her as a perfect porcelain doll. He looked into the flames, his face a mask of old, deep-seated pain. But porcelain, as you know, is brittle. The whispers, the expectations, the casual cruelties of the life we led, they put cracks in her. And one day she simply shattered. His voice broke on the last word. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I retreated. I built these walls around my home and my heart, and I swore I would never again watch someone I cared for be broken by the shallow viciousness of that world. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. Then I saw you. I saw you at dinners, at soirees, enduring your husband's neglect with a grace that was nothing short of breathtaking. I saw the steel in your spine. And that night at the Pemberton ball, when I heard what he said, and I saw you walk away, not broken but forged, I knew. Clear's throat. I knew I could not stand by and watch that world attempt to extinguish your light as it had extinguished hers. I have been watching over you for months, Eleanora, admiring you. It was a confession that laid his own scarred heart bare. He was not a rescuer swooping in to save a damsel. He was a fellow survivor who had recognized the strength in another and had resolved to offer his own as a shield. In that firelit library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages and the wildness of the storm, Eleanora felt the last of the ice around her own heart begin to melt. Their fragile peace was shattered a few days later by the arrival of a letter bearing Alistair's seal. It was delivered by a frantic courier who had ridden half the night. Valerius brought it to her in the conservatory, where she was tending to a collection of frost-damaged camellias. His face was like granite. The letter was not for him, but for her. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Alistair's words were a torrent of rage, threats, and demands. He accused her of adultery, of theft, of ruining him. He called her his property and demanded her immediate return, threatening to use the full force of the law to drag her back to his house. The last line was a snarl of desperation. Lady Beatrice's father has withdrawn his offer. My creditors are at the door. This is your doing, you conniving shrew. The air left Eleanora's lungs. The cage she had escaped was threatening to reassemble itself around her. She looked up at Valerius, her eyes wide with a fear she thought she had conquered. He simply took the letter from her shaking fingers, crumpled it into a ball, and tossed it into a nearby waste bin. He cannot touch you, Valerius said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He is mistaken about the timeline of his ruin. Eleanora looked at him, confused. What do you mean? A faint, grim smile touched the Duke's lips. It was the smile of a predator that has already cornered its prey. For the past 6 months, my agents have been quietly acquiring Viscount Thorne's debts. All of them. The gambling markers from his clubs, the loans against his estate, the promissory notes to his tailor and his vintner. I own every shilling of his considerable and foolishly incurred obligations. He let that sink in. He is not being ruined, Eleonora. He is already ruined. The letters from his creditors that are causing him such distress bear my signature. She stared at him, speechless. He had not merely offered her a shield. He had systematically dismantled the entire army that besieged her, and he had done so in absolute secret. He had armed himself on her behalf long before she even knew she was in a war. He stepped closer, his usual severity replaced by a raw, profound vulnerability. You are free, Eleonora, legally, financially, and socially. He has no power over you. His threats are the desperate rattling of an empty tin. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. But this is not enough. A life in hiding is not a life. I am asking you to return to London. With me. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I do not wish to be your saviour. I wish to be your partner. I am asking you to be my wife, my Duchess. Not as an act of protection, but as an act of alliance. Stand with me, and we will face them together. We will build a life, not on the ashes of your past, but on the foundation of our shared strength. It was a proposal unlike any she could have ever imagined. It was not about rescue. It was about reinforcement. It was about equality. Looking at this powerful, complex man, who had seen her value when no one else had, who had honoured her strength and shielded her weakness, she knew her answer. Yes, she whispered, her voice clear and steady. Yes, Valerius. The Duke of Blackwood's ball was the most anticipated event of the late season. His return to society after years of self-imposed exile was a seismic event. When the invitations went out, they were seen as royal summonses. To be excluded was a social death sentence. Viscount Thorne and Lady Beatrice, clinging to the last vestiges of their social standing, secured an invitation through a distant connection, determined to brazen out the rumours and whispers that now followed them like a foul odour. They arrived late, a desperate attempt to make an entrance. But the moment they stepped into the glittering ballroom of Blackwood House, they knew they had made a fatal error. The room was a sea of London's elite, but all eyes were on the host, and on his arm, looking not like a victim, but like a queen, was Eleonora. She was radiant, dressed in a gown the colour of midnight velvet, adorned with a simple but magnificent necklace of Blackwood diamonds. Her posture was perfect, her expression serene and confident. She was not the grey mouse Alistair had tried to discard. She was a panther, sleek and powerful, at the side of a lion. Alistair froze, his face draining of colour. Beatrice's haughty expression faltered. Before they could retreat, the Duke and Eleonora began to move towards them, their progress parting the crowd like a ship through water. Valerius did not raise his voice. He did not cause a scene. His actions were as quiet and as devastating as a blade of ice. He stopped before them, his eyes glacial. "Thorne," he said, his voice a soft murmur that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "I believe we have some business to conclude." He produced a slim leather portfolio from the hand of a waiting solicitor. "As of this afternoon, my acquisition of your total debt is complete. The deeds to your family estate, your London residence, and the Thorne heirlooms, which you so foolishly leveraged, are now my property. You are, to put it plainly, a guest in what was, until this morning, your own home." Alistair sputtered, his face a mottled purple. You can't." "I can," Valerius stated flatly, "and I have." He then raised his voice just enough for those nearby to hear clearly. "And it gives me the greatest pleasure to announce my engagement to the future Duchess of Blackwood." He turned his gaze, full of warmth and admiration, upon Eleanora. The announcement rippled through the room, a shockwave of gossip and awe. It was a checkmate. Alistair's ruin was now complete and public. In a final pathetic act of defiance, he turned on Eleanora, his voice a venomous hiss. "You planned this, all of it. You conniving, scheming." Eleanora met his gaze without flinching. Her voice when she spoke was not filled with anger or triumph, but with a calm, surgical precision that cut him to the bone. "You called me a mouse, my lord. Quart. In that you were correct. A mouse, you see, is quiet, it is overlooked. But it can chew through the ropes of a lion's net when he is trapped." She gave him a look of cool, distant pity. "You, however, are merely the net full of holes, and easily discarded." She said nothing more. She simply turned her back on him. A final, graceful dismissal, and took the Duke's arm. It was over. Later that evening, they stood in the quiet solitude of the Blackwood House gardens, the distant sounds of the ball, a faint melody behind them. The moon was high and bright, silvering the leaves of the ancient oaks. Valerius turned to her, his severe face softened by an emotion so profound it seemed to remake his features. He reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from her cheek. "Eleanora," he murmured, his voice thick with feeling. He lowered his head, and in the cool, moonlit air he kissed her. It was not a kiss of victory or possession. It was a kiss of homecoming, a quiet, passionate sealing of their alliance, their partnership, their love. They were married a week later in a small private ceremony, and immediately retreated to the wild, wind-swept sanctuary of Blackwood Manor. The world of London with its scandals and whispers faded away, becoming nothing more than a distant rumour. Blackwood was their world now, a kingdom they would rule together. A year passed. The epilogue of their story was not written in the society pages, but in the quiet, thriving life they built. Eleanora, the Duchess of Blackwood, had transformed the manor's greenhouses into a botanical marvel, a lush paradise of rare and beautiful plants that drew correspondence from scholars across the continent. She was no longer the invisible Viscountess, but a woman of purpose and passion, her intelligence finally given the soil in which to flourish. Valerius was a changed man. The Iron Duke had melted away, revealing the warm, devoted man beneath. He was often seen walking the gardens with his wife, the sound of his genuine laughter, now a common occurrence at the manor. He had found in her not just a partner, but the missing piece of his own fractured soul. She had not just healed his heart, she had made it whole. News from the outside world arrived occasionally, like driftwood from a faraway shipwreck. Alistair was living in a state of penurious exile in Calais, a bitter, forgotten man. Lady Beatrice, her family's reputation damaged by the scandal, had been married off to an ageing, gout-ridden baron with a title but little else. They were spectres from a life that no longer felt real. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Eleanora and Valerius stood on a hill overlooking the vast, wild expanse of their lands, she leaned her head against his shoulder. The wind whipped at her hair, and the air was clean and sharp. This was her sanctuary, this was her home. He had not taken everything from her old life. He had given her the strength to leave it behind and claim a new one. He had treated the poor, neglected wife of a viscount like she was everything, and in doing so he had finally found everything in himself.